welcome to the Sutliffian Report, the show where the news is not hidden and the truth is always the winner. Now, tonight we have with us, starting out, Todd Bensman. Todd Bensman is a national security expert that works for the Center for Immigration Studies. Todd is one of those few people that go out of their way to get the truth. He goes right down, does the interviews himself, finds the truth. It's not always an easy thing to do. So he's traveling a lot this year to find out what's true. And one of his articles is just one of those things we have to talk about. His article is on, let me just get this up. His article is on how terrorists are going on he says migration, but the Arabic word would be hijra, over European borders, and what they can, and what are we supposed to learn from that in the United States about border security? Now, I'm going to bring him in, and Todd, I would love for you, I did not put this in my list of questions I would ask you, but before I bring you on, please, I'm just going to open the mic now. Please tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, because I always feel like I don't do you justice. Hello? And I think, let me try here. Todd?
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. For some reason, the other one didn't work. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just go by the phone.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about who you are before we get into this, because I feel like I ever do you justice for that.
Oh, okay, sure. So I am the Senior National Security Fellow for the Center for Immigration Studies. I've been with the organization for about a year and a half now. For about 10 years before that, I was intelligence manager for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Intelligence Counterterrorism Division, where I work primarily on counterterrorism issues with all of our federal partners. I did that for about 10 years, and prior to that, I was a journalist, national security reporter for about 20 years. So I'm kind of betraying my age a little bit here. So that's kind of the short, skinny version of my background.
Well, we're taking great value in your experience and insight. So I bet you never thought it would all head up to where you're at now. That's wow.
No, you can't really predict these things.
That's the wonder of it. Well, you wrote an article in November, and I don't think it got the fame it deserved, and Gatestone picked it up this past week, right? And
yeah,
they're starting to notice how important it is. Your article on the lessons that America should learn from the hijra the terrorists are taking into Europeans' borders. Can you tell us about the difference in the threat since 2011? Because that's one of the things that actually you talk about that I think is extremely important.
What we're talking about here is a study that I did quantifying how often migrants from the Middle East breached the external European border and conducted attacks or plotted to conduct attacks or were just caught in the interior lodging asylum claims. And that was the gist, because nobody has really attempted to quantify how often that happened during the big migration crisis that Europe had, that kind of started after 2011 because of the Arab Spring and all of the tumult that was going on in those Arab countries. Then there was the war in Syria that led to the war in Syria, and before too long you had about almost 3 million migrants make their way into Germany and France and Sweden and Finland, and right over the borders. They crashed the border system. And ISIS of Syria was there to watching what was happening, and they deployed operatives into that migration flow. For the first time in contemporary terrorism history that's happened, where they purposefully deployed terrorist operatives into a camouflaging migrant flow. And once they got into the European countries, target countries, they attacked. And the most notorious of the attacks, the first big one, was, of course, the Paris attack of November 2015. And a few months later, the Brussels attack, March 2016. Hundreds of people wounded, at least 130 killed. And then from that point on, it's been nonstop, smaller scale terror attacks and plots by people who came in over the borders. Now, why do we care about that here in the United States? Well, because that's the first time in contemporary history that we have seen this terror travel tactic. And we have our own open border, and we have our own flow of migrants from those same countries, smaller flows from those same countries reaching our border from the Middle East and South Asia and North Africa. And so it matters. I make the argument in this study that it matters. But the first thing that needed to happen was it needed to be quantified. Nobody has even attempted to quantify. This is incredibly politically incorrect in Europe to link migration with terrorism. But there it is. It's linked.
There's a French article, I believe, that was written, but I'd have to go back. I'm trying to find a translation of it that connected it. It's about I can't find an English translation, of the article. I was informed of that, and then I believe there's a German document on the same topic, but I don't think it's quantifying. That's the big difference. Quantifying has to do with numbers. I think they may be more qualitative. For those of you unfamiliar with those two words, those are two different kinds of academic studies that you learn when you start to do things like PhD type writing. And unfortunately, I'm not going to go that way. But
that's okay. I've got it quantified to a certain extent, to the extent that I could do it.
Yeah.
There was one other researcher in Europe who attempted to quantify this, and this is really pathetic, honestly. This was a major series of attacks all over Europe that involved migrants that came in over the border. That's just an obvious point of study that you have to figure that out, but nobody did it. So my study found that 104 Islamist extremists entered the EU between 2014 and 2018 and conducted attacks or got caught, plotting attacks, or just had extensive illegal connectivity with terrorist organizations. The other study, yeah.
I'm sorry. I want to get to one thing. You're mentioning these stats, but I think one of the things you pointed out while we were doing this was that while you were doing your article, you pointed out there was a document from Washington that missed this stuff on stats.
Yeah.
What was that about?
That's the White House's most recent national counterterrorism strategy. And when you read that document, and this is one that, most administrations put one of these out. The Obama administration did. The Bush administration started this after 9/11. And it's the national outlook for, outcomes, policy outcomes and objectives for counterterrorism. And this, the Trump administration document pointed out in the opening paragraphs that the European theater suffered terror attacks by migrants who came in over the border, and that this is a phenomenon that American Homeland Security agencies have to pay attention to at our own border. And it was striking that they even mentioned that. But then at that point in 2018, still nobody had tried to quantify how often it had happened. So the document said that 2 terrorists had done that in Europe, when, you know, obviously by that time there were many, many more that you could point to just in the popular media. And it just sort of underscored this need for somebody to study this, just come out with an initial descriptive study of how often it happened. Why nobody in Europe did it is just, you know, probably political correctness. It's incredibly inflammatory to connect terrorism to illegal immigration over the borders.
It's mind-numbing, just like you're saying. I mean, they know they've got a problem. They're afraid to talk about it, lest they be called haters. And I think they're all afraid of being labeled politically incorrect, and which leads in Europe, it leads to a being fired from your job if you're found.
Yeah,
that way.
you're canceled. You're canceled. But you know, we were able to justify a study just based on the fact that the White House's national counterterrorism strategy talked about this and warned about it, an official government strategic document that stands to this day. It is the current document on counterterrorism strategy in the United States. They're warning about this. So what's it all about? No media has seized on it. No, the New York Times hasn't touched it. In fact, the New York Times said that the strategy document doesn't even mention this, and it does mention it, like prominently.
Well, they're upset for telling. You
on.
Can't tell the truth. Yes, they don't want to tell the truth about this, and they're the ones that claimed for many years there was no such thing as refugees who were terrorists. Yet you can directly link that easily here. I did it. In my affidavit I filed in federal courts. Geez, yeah. Okay. I want to get into your study because you found 16 completed terror attacks involving 29 migrants. What can you tell us about that?
Right. Well, 29. Now, keep in mind that this is just between 2014 and 2018. There were some that happened before 2014, and there have been quite a few that have happened in 2019, which is after my study. So it's still going on. This is an unfolding story, if you will. So I just snapshotted those 4 years, and I came up with 29 migrants who were involved in 16 completed attacks in 9 countries. Now, most of the damage was done in France during the Paris attacks. There were 6 distinct attacks involved in that one day in Paris, November 2015. These killed 170 people, wounded 878 more, big shootouts. This doesn't include the 2016 Christmas market vehicle ramming attack by the Tunisian asylum seeker, which fell outside of my study frame. That killed 12 people and injured a bunch more. But we have far less notorious attacks that occurred, but besides Paris, I mean, we've had small edged weapon kinds of attacks, axe attacks on trains, knife attacks on people. 2-3 people at a time would get wounded by one of these guys, one of these migrants. Typical example was a guy named Muhammad Riyad. He was a Pakistani who came into Germany in 2015. He was supposedly an unaccompanied minor, but he just lied about his age. Was living in a refugee center, and suddenly he, gets an axe and a knife and attacks people that were outside a train in the Wurzburg station in July 2016. He was shot to death. They found ISIS flag and martyr letter in his room, the whole bit. Another guy, Abdurrahman Mekha, 22-year-old Moroccan, came in over by the sea route, stabbed 2 women to death, wounded 6 in August 2017 in Finland. Finland almost never got terror attacks before this, but they accepted quite a few of these migrants and paid the price. Police shot and wounded that guy, but he had come in again as a refugee over the border and the whole bit. And there were just a number of these were conducted by the same members of the same ISIS cell. They were deployed purposefully by ISIS's external operations division to conduct attacks, go in. Some of these guys were European citizens who couldn't go in the normal way because they were already on the radar. They'd get arrested if they tried to fly in, so they got fraudulent Syrian passports, took on fake Syrian names and pretended to be Syrian refugees, and smuggled their way over to Greece and then up through the Balkans and around, and finally got into France and Belgium and have been doing attacks.
Sorry for interrupting. You said some of them had Syrian passports. I mean, where's the sanity in trusting that? Even British and European newspapers did things about how you could buy you could go buy a Syrian passport. ISIS was selling them. Oh, gee. Oh my gosh.
Right. You have to keep in mind, though, that in the context of that time was that the border control systems of the EU had collapsed by then, because just under the weight of numbers. And just like we had almost 1 million migrants from Central America come in and crash our systems over the past year, but they were just simply overwhelmed, and it was all they could do to just give them some kind of paperwork when they came in and said, show up later. There was absolutely no time or room or capability or capacity for any sort of vetting during that period of time. And that's what ISIS took advantage of. They knew that they would be able to just come and go as they pleased. And then, of course, Europe had the Schengen Zone Agreement, which means that once you're inside any one of those EU countries, you can cross any other country's borders without any sort of check. So once they got into Greece, they had pretty much free reign all over Europe. They could go anywhere. It's one of the reasons why the Brits decided to exit, decided on Brexit, is they were thinking, well, these people are going to show up in the UK here pretty soon and start doing attacks here, and of course they have.
Yes, those are really, really important points. Thank you for that. I knew you'd pull them out. I want to go. Your study goes on, and this next number. Wow, you mentioned 25 terror attacks, and there was 37 migrants involved. Can you give us some examples of that?
Right. Well, keep in mind that the Europeans don't ordinarily release full names, but they do.
Yes.
They do have, their court system does provide details of the charges, and but here's a guy, a 16-year-old Syrian war refugee. He'd been in Damascus with his family and traveled from Lebanon and Turkey and got into Germany in about January 2016. And within about 8 or 9 months, he was building a bomb, filled with sewing needles. And he was going to attack a soft target in Cologne, but somebody dimed him out, and authorities managed to get him just in time. By the way, about 22 of these people were arrested while they still were in migrant camps, in migrant facilities. Like they hadn't even been, paroled into the country. Like they hadn't gotten their feet under them yet. They were still there. This is one of the guys that got caught at a migrant camp. Then there's the case of a 25-year-old Moroccan, and he was planning to massacre a bunch of train passengers on the French Amsterdam to Paris train. This was in the summer of 2015. They actually made a movie out of this one a couple of years. It's not a very good movie, but this guy was, his name was Ayoub El-Kazani, And luckily, when he went to do his attack, he had guns and knives and everything. There were a couple of U.S. servicemen who were on the train, and they subdued him. One of them was wounded during this thing, but it was regarded as a thwarted attack. That guy had been living in Spain and then moved to Belgium, France, and he was moving all around. Then went to fight with ISIS in Syria, and then he used the migration routes to re-enter Europe. That's typical. Another guy, there's a Gambian from Africa who pledged allegiance to ISIS, got into Sicily on one of those big migrant boats with 800 other migrants in about March 2017. And Italian authorities nabbed him in April of 2018 in Naples as he was planning to drive a vehicle into crowds, do a vehicle ramming attack, because he was still in communication with ISIS.
Oh, wow.
And they were coaching him the whole way. Now, these are in many other attacks like this you never heard of. None of these things may make much U.S. press, but they do make some European press, and the information is out there to be collected, and that's what I tried to do.
Wow. Some of this stuff is just kind of, you're right. It doesn't make the news here enough. That is, I guess the numbers here that what's getting me too is you have 25 attacks, 37 migrants mentioned. The one before was 16 attack. 16 completed attacks with 29 migrants. 29. That's almost 30 people. And then you have 25 stopped or thwarted attacks. I think thwarted is more accurate because you were just talking about the servicemen. There was an attack engaged and it was stopped. So thwarted is
right. So
and
you have to remember too that some of these thwarted attacks were really long, terrible public gun battles where they got the guys cornered in an apartment and there were shootouts in the open streets. What was happening in Europe during these years were just like, running gun battles. The Europeans were just, they understood what had happened, that these migrants had gotten in, that ISIS had sent these guys in, but they were almost wholly unprepared to, intelligence-wise, to track them down or figure out where the next attack was going to be. So most of these governments declared states of emergency, and it's like the French and the Belgium government, and they were just acting on tips and leads, and they had militarized their police, and it was just crazy for about a year straight, and they would track people down, and there would be gunfights, and the European landscape was just terrified and littered with bodies, and some of these thwarted plots were thwarted by government gunfire. It was just crazy what was going on over there, but almost invariably nobody really, once the shooting stopped, nobody really took time to study how the guy got in. That they came in over the border with the refugees, with the migrants, just like they could come in at our border with the Central Americans. And Trump warned about this about a year ago.
This is Italy's salvation was Salvini. I think Salvini for a while, and now it's gone. They're trying to put him in jail for having stopped them.
They had two salvations. One was Salvini when he refused to let these ships dock and empty themselves out. And he did some other things too, like he cut a deal with Libyan militias to basically paid them to shut the spigot off at their end. But then the Hungarians saved Europe by building a fence. Almost all of these migrants, I would say like the vast majority of these migrant terrorists, got into Western Europe by way of the Balkan route, meaning Greece, and then north through Macedonia and Bosnia to Hungary and beyond. And the Hungarians just put up a fence and electrified it and said, our border is closed. And that shut that flow down. And there had not been really many more terrorists that came through there. And the European Union's suing Hungary for doing that, and Poland too.
Insane.
Yeah, they've got them in an international court of law, saying that they're not doing their share to accept migrants. When the Hungarians actually shut down the flow of fighters going right into Germany, blowing stuff up. So it's really it's rich with irony.
Yes,
with Salvini and the Hungarians.
Yes. And wow. There's one more piece to your study that is really, really important. There's 39 more migrants that you found to be involved in terrorism in some way, and from what I got from that is that I would say the vast majority had connections to terrorist entities. I was struck how anyone could let their people. Again, what we've been talking about is how do you let these people enter without documentation? That's one of the things. What you just were saying earlier, how their border security system had failed, and due to Schengen, the only real border security they really had was on the outside of Europe.
At that time, yeah. And of course, now the Schengen Agreement, which was heralded as this, revolutionary idea for internal trade and the movement of people and goods, is over, because most of those countries, due to this terrorism, reinstituted border controls. And those border controls are in place. Schengen's over because of this terrorism, and nobody's really talking about that. But the fact of the matter is, all those borders from Austria and between France and Belgium and Finland, and they've reinstituted all of the border controls that had been eliminated, but because of this terrorism. But yeah, the 39 you're talking about. What we're talking about there are people that came in with the migrants and weren't necessarily arrested for a particular plot and didn't conduct an attack, but they had commanded a group of fighters in Syria that massacred people and cut heads off and tortured people and things like that. And now with the Islamic State Caliphate militarily defeated, people had to run somewhere, and they escaped through the migration, war criminals, people that had conducted atrocities on behalf of al-Nusra or ISIS or whatever, got into Europe and tried to hide. And over time, I guess occasionally they get dined out, and Europeans would go do an arrest. That's still happening.
Yes.
And the reason is because, again, you show up at the border with no identification and say, my name is Mickey Mouse, and, the terrorists were mean to me. Can I come in? And at that point, they were just, just like what we do at our border. My name's Mickey Mouse. I lost my ID. It got stolen, whatever. It sunk in the river, whatever. And we just wave them in and say, okay, we'll give you a date for your asylum claim. And that's what's going on there. We've had quite a few of these guys. The one that really kind of strikes me is a guy named Ben Nasser Mehdi, and he was a Tunisian explosives expert. This guy actually was arrested in 2008 in Europe and Italy and got sentenced to prison for terrorism charges. He's the head of an Al-Qaeda cell. He gets extradited to Tunisia, and then in October 2015, he gets on a boat and comes back from Libya, lands on Lampedusa Island there in Italy. That's where they're all going, and just made up a name and claimed asylum and went to work as a bricklayer. And then, that guy was kind of an idiot. He was active on social media. Everybody knew who he was, and he was saying where he was. So the authorities were able to just go pick him up. But this is a guy who, already had a history of terrorism, took advantage of this migration crisis, and came in on a boat. And there are lots of people like that. Lots of them were like that.
Wow.
People that cut heads off, did ethnic cleansing campaigns in Kurdish areas. One guy kidnapped a UN observer from Canada and, held him at gunpoint and was his main guard. And he came in applying for asylum in Germany. And, really the stories are outrageous about how porous and how fail-prone the European system was during that time and even before then. It's like they never thought that terrorists would no terrorist would ever try to cross a border. That's crazy. There's easier ways to come in, they would say.
Yeah. So in your study, I don't think I read it in there, but I was curious. Was there any evidence that European governments were just ignoring the threat by ISIS? And they had been saying they're going to send their men into Europe for quite a while. Was there any evidence that they were ignoring that?
Well, actually, just before the crisis began, and as it was building, they did try to deploy the European. There were problems because there were so many different agencies and they didn't collaborate very well. But they did recognize that there was a gathering threat, and they did try to deploy counter-smuggling groups to break up the smuggling organizations, and they did deploy more intelligence analysts and officers in some of the origin countries. But it was really too little too late, and they were just swamped. They were just completely swamped by the sheer numbers, and that is Angela Merkel's fault, because
yes.
She came out and said, everybody's welcome. We're just a welcoming country. This isn't Nazi Germany anymore. This is the new Germany. And we want diversity and everybody's welcome. And the second she said that, the flood was on. And then the French said it and the Swedes said it. And everybody was afraid to unsay it. So before you knew it, you had three, except for the Hungarians and the Polish and the Czechs to a certain extent, who are persona non grata to the rest of Europe. But I think they were the only ones who had their heads on their shoulders right on this, because you ended up with 3 million migrants.
Yeah. It's kind of mind-numbing. Let's see. You state that after applying for temporary protection, such as asylum, Islamic terrorists have about 11 months plan or carry out. They had about 11 months to plan or carry out their threat. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Right.
So almost everybody who comes in over the U.S. border applies for some kind of protection, and it's the same in Europe. When they would show up, they would apply for either as a refugee for some kind of protection as a refugee, or under the Convention Against Torture, or asylum. There are a number of different kinds of protection you could ask for, and the act of asking for that got you into Europe legally to wait for your hearing and the adjudications of these. But they were so overloaded with these claims that the backlog grew from 6 months to, in some cases, 30 months and 35 months. On average, about 11 months between the time of entry and the time of an arrest or an attack. So what the significance of that is that the act of request, if you're a terrorist with nefarious motives, the act of applying for international protection, asylum, or whatever it is at the border, buys you the time inside the country, the target country, to carry out your attack. And that's what happened. That's what happened. So they sort of were able to exploit the asylum process to incubate their plots, to work their plots out before. And also the other important thing is that the asylum processes in Europe were incapable of detecting bad guys. In other words, there was no vetting involved in the asylum processes that resulted in captures of terrorists before they could plot or any of that. Like they're just strictly civil administrative matters where they didn't have any sort of built-in security vetting to try to determine who these people are, if they were bad guys or not, just like the American asylum process. And so I just draw a direct parallel between what happened in Europe and what happens at our border. People show up at our border. My name is Mickey Mouse. Here's a letter of, here's with your court date. We'll see you in 3 years,
Wow. And here we find out that a large percentage don't even show up for their court date. So I'm guessing that's about somewhere around that 11-month thing is where they don't show for their appointment, and all of a sudden they send someone out to check on them. Is that about what the 11-month point is, or?
Well, the 11 months was the average time spent in Europe before they either attacked or got arrested.
Okay.
So they got, but the average, there was a big backlog in Europe. They've got it a little bit more under control now. But the ideal period of time before the crisis was about 6 months, which is still plenty of time for a bad guy who gave his name as Mickey Mouse to conduct an attack. And they come in without. It's not like you can call the Syrian government up and say, "Hey, do you guys mind providing us your intel on this guy?" Because
even James Comey said we couldn't do that, and we don't trust James Comey. But wow, I mean, even he went before Congress and said that was impossible. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, you just take their word. The Europeans took their word for it. We take their word for it. We may do a little bit of checking, but and some database checks, and we might sometimes even interview them, looking for signs of deception once they get to our border. But really, like in the case of Somalis that show up, and there were quite a few Somalis that conducted terror attacks or were caught plotting in Europe and also in the United States, I might add.
Yes.
But there wasn't a Somali government for 30 years, so nobody got birth certificates or driver's licenses or anything like that, or got arrested for rape or murder or terrorism or anything. There's no records at all on Somalis. So when Somalis show up in Europe or here, we just listen to what they say. If it sounds pretty good, we let them in.
Wow. That explains some other things I'll have to share with you offline sometime. Wow.
Well, there's some refugees in not to get off track, but some refugee cases of Somalis in Arizona right now, where they were Al-Shabaab guerrilla fighters, and they came in and just made up names, and we let them right in as refugees. They didn't come over the border. They came in through the supposedly enhanced security vetting processes that we have for refugees that we give overseas. There's an Al-Qaeda guy right now just arrested in Phoenix that the Iraqis are trying to extradite. And this is a guy who was an assassin for Al Qaeda in Iraq and murdered police officers, and somehow he just made up a name and got in. They vetted him for a refugee as a refugee. He made it to Phoenix and got married and has a kid and the whole bit. Just like in Europe, they're finding these guys that committed atrocities and war crimes and all the rest. They just made up a name.
Well, one of the things, I don't want to miss this part. I know we're probably running down in your time. You did a couple other things in your article, which I found very impressive, because I don't think enough people who talk about terrorism and the dangers of basically what we're talking about, the migration or we talk about the hijra. You talked about how it was affecting elections, and I found that highly impressive. Was there any positive results to that?
Okay, yeah. So, what I wanted to do was, and as I was conducting the research, I was noticing that every time there was a terror attack by a migrant in Europe, the governments and the people, got bowed up. If you have a big running gun battle in your city center, with migrant terrorists getting killed and police officers wounded and all the rest of that, people tend to notice. People also tend to notice declarations of emergency and troops everywhere, and their lives are really changed by these attacks. The Schengen zone, reinstitution of borders, internal borders, that's inconvenient. And so what happens is, the people of the voting populations of Europe understood exactly what the cause of these terror attacks was, and they showed their displeasure by voting. They went to the poll, and every country that held elections that had terror attacks and large numbers of migrants from the Middle East had historic changes that had, like, first time since World War II kind of changes, like in Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Italy. All of them had national elections that put into power for the first time any party that was talking about restricting migration. And that's just a fact. And the voters, this was all, of course, described as nationalistic, xenophobic Islamophobia, but it wasn't Islamophobia. It was a response to terror attacks that were going on one after another. It really, there could have been maybe some of the mass rapes in Germany and in Sweden. There have been a lot of rapes by the migrants, but nothing proved to be as much of an impetus for electoral change than the terror attacks that were happening. People don't like terror attacks, terrorism in their midst. They hate it, and they demand that their parties and elected leaders fix that. And so they did. I mean, and I mean, this was, the impacts were just far-ranging. I know I've only got 104, but man, for 104 terrorist migrants, wow, what an impact! I mean, this resulted in a major military campaign that involved U.S. forces, special operation forces, and our Air Force to close what's called the Manjib Gap in Syria, through which ISIS was sending their operatives into the flow. It was about a 60-mile section of the Syria-Turkey border, and the campaign was incredibly bloody to shut that thing down. We bombed. There was a lot of collateral damage. It was an expensive campaign, but nobody's ever thought to link that campaign. It was ordered by the U.S. and NATO and all of the allied governments because of the Paris and Brussels attacks.
I had not heard of this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a military campaign over this. Wow. 104 guys.
So, what do you recommend to make America safer with all these lessons that we're learning from that you shared about from your quantitative study? Quantitative study. What do you recommend we do?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that there's a new terror travel tactic on the books, and that's border crossing, use of migrant caravans and as camouflage. And we have to recognize that that's it's been born. It's a fact on the ground, and we have to recognize it and respond to it. The first thing is you just have to acknowledge it. I haven't really seen beyond that counterterrorism strategy document. Nobody really talks about it. The president tried to talk about it about a year ago. And what we do is in the United States is we do have counter-smuggling interdiction operations that we target these unique long-distance smuggling organizations that bring them over the ocean into South America and in smaller numbers than what was happening in Europe. But remember, they can camouflage among the Central Americans, just like Trump said. And what needs to happen first is we need to invest much more resources into ICE, Homeland Security investigations, which is the tip of the spear. They're down there doing counter-smuggling investigations and trying to roll these smuggling organizations up. Without those smuggling organizations, you can't make the trip over the Atlantic. That requires air travel, which is a big difference, and it's much more expensive. But the routes are certainly there. We get 3,000 to 4,000 people from the Middle East and those Muslim majority countries every year that hit our southern border. And quite a few of them have been terror watch listed. Yemenis, for example, in the last year, and Somalis in past years, and Hezbollah in past years as well, right over the border. So the other thing is that Panama and Mexico are bottlenecks. They're bottleneck points. And if Panama and Mexico were to start repatriation flights of those migrants back to their home countries or to safe third countries, that would do a lot to deter more from coming because you're spending $30,000.
Your term repatriation, Can you define that a little bit better, please?
Yeah, put them on planes and fly them home. Okay. For example, if Middle Eastern, Lebanese, or Egyptians are coming over the border, or Yemenis are coming over the border of Panama and Mexico, they should be stopped, detained, and a way to figure out where they can be deported to, and then put them on planes and deport them, fly them back to a safe third country, maybe a place with a refugee camp somewhere. If they're Somalis, maybe fly them to Kenya. That has to be worked out exactly where some of them can't be. You can't just fly them into Iran. And I've met Iranians. Coming through Panama and interviewed them. And I've met Iraqis and Bangladeshis and all kinds of Pakistanis. They're all coming, usually without identification. But if those people understood that they could be repatriated by air, that means they lose $20,000 in borrowed money or whatever. They're not going to be able to do it again.
And they're not worried about paying that money because they've gone. That's exactly it. I like that. That's
money
a good
is
idea.
Gone. I think it would be incredibly effective if we started doing that. But instead, Panama, the government of Panama, puts these people on buses and moves them straight north to the next country, of Costa Rica, and Costa Rica does the same thing and moves them by bus and feeds them and shelters them and gives them medical attention and then buses them up to Nicaragua. Well, that's no help. That's not a good counterterrorism alliance. Mexico more recently, because of the Trump administration, has been stopping them in southern Mexico just in the last few months. But if they can get around the Mexicans and they make it to our border, we let them right in. We're waving these migrants from the Middle East right into the country on asylum claims.
This is the extracontinental, that you were talking about. I think that's what we need to come up with, is a policy to deal with extracontinentals. I think that's probably our biggest priority right now. From the work that you've shared with on your articles and various forums, that's probably the whole thing that shocked me the most. I don't know what else we can do, but we have to change I think that's the first place we have to change policy. But I do want to say thank you for joining us. I'm unfortunately running out of time for this. It's your article is so drastically important, and I think the importance of it too is that it's in English. And like I was saying, there's a couple reports one is in German, one is in French, and because I don't read German or French, those when they're written in languages that don't get translated, I'd say the majority of Europe sometimes loses because of that, and that I think we're losing too. And the only reason I know about them is some people have pointed them out to me, and I says, well, can you give me a translated version? And nobody can. They don't point to a translated version. You just have to be able to read that language, and that's not me. I'm sorry. It's frustrating.
Well, you can, okay, but you can find my study at CIS.org, and the title of it is "What Terrorist Migration Over European Borders Can Teach About American Border Security." I hope your listeners will go to that and take the time to read the full report. There's also we held a panel at the National Press Club a few months ago on this, and there's good video of me discussing it, and also some guests, including an FBI agent who was involved in this kind of vetting, this kind of migration inside Mexico. A pretty rare glimpse at what the FBI was doing with this traffic after 9/11.
I think Trump's policies have made us safer. You talk about that, how it's how we're doing the vetting inside Mexico rather than letting a majority of them into the country. I think that's key, but there's so many more things we could go on with it.
They can get around it, and if something happens with Trump, he loses the election or whatever, Mexico will just go back to being a transit country, and they'll just be coming right on through again. It's a very tenuous situation with the Mexicans down there. It's just a Trump-oriented policy, and when he goes, so does the policy.
That's a scary, scary thing. I'm going to hope and pray he wins in November. I want to say thank you for joining us, and oh my gosh, Todd, you're a fountain of knowledge, and please don't stop what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
It's very, very important. I can't tell you enough. I share your articles all the time on LinkedIn, and I've got like 16,000 connections, and I'm hoping I'm connecting with the right people in DC that are actually listening to the articles that I share of yours. Hopefully, somebody there will wake up and start to do the right thing. Hopefully. I have to say goodbye because I'm running out of time to get to the news articles. But God bless you.
All right.
Please don't stop.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and helping to spread the word about this, because regular media just hates this connection between terrorism and migration. They're just somehow there's something wrong in the DNA about this kind of information, and it's hard to get information out there, without people like you helping out. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to see if I can put this interview up on YouTube later, because I think there's so much great value in it, and I'll see if I can share that out better. God bless. Thank you.
Take care.
Wow.